So we're kind of moving away from this large data, large scale application where everyone is kind of the average of the population. And with these sensors coming online, we're now able to get to a more individualized N of one experiments where we understand what works for you, where you are, how you progress, and so forth.
Hi everyone, welcome to Soft Matters Startup Series. We have here with us today Arnar Larusson, the CEO and founder of Tyme Wear. Welcome, Arnar.
Thank you for having me.
So Arnar, maybe just to get us kick-started, why don't you share with us a little bit about your personal journey, your entrepreneurial journey, to get to where you are today?
I started in mechanical engineering. And I was always very interested in the human body and how everything functions. And very quickly after starting my undergrad, I started developing in the R&D department of a prosthetics company where I was able to attach knees and ankles to amputees and figure out how to make those mechanical devices work as close to or as good as the remaining leg. And so I got introduced to this whole world of biomechanics and physiology and applying engineering to it. After finishing my studies, I ended up doing a research fellowship at Harvard where we were looking at how to make exoskeletons soft. And that was a project that was funded by the US military, by DARPA. During that time, we were figuring out all sorts of new materials and ways to attach things to people. At the same time, understanding more in-depth things about human physiology, like how our metabolism or how our metabolic output, so the energy that we expend, works. So the goal of the project was really to make walking more efficient. So the military wanted to make their soldiers more efficient out in the field, use less energy. And so we had people and ourselves in the lab collecting all sorts of data in the $1 million worth of equipment, getting really fine-grained and detailed information about each person to understand how we can make them more efficient, and then creating the devices to actually make them more efficient. As an athlete myself, which is kind of another lens that I bring to all of this, is that I'm a classic case of someone that trained too much. I didn't have a stopper when I was a teenager, so I overtrained, some would say, and to the point where I had a lot of fatigue in my system and injuries and things like that. So that always kind of, that insight of you can do too much as you can do too little, that kind of insight always stayed with me. The insights really started to come in as I was looking at the data that we were seeing and how big of a separation there was between what we were seeing in the lab and how individualized, like we could literally see that if this person trained this way, they wouldn't overtrain. If they trained this way, they would improve. And these were all markers that were measurable in someone's physiology. And so I got really interested in this question of like, why does this gap exist between what's available in the field and the insights that we have there, and then the insights that we have in the lab where we can really see what's going on? Why isn't that gap closer? The big reason why that gap exists is simply because the ability to capture some of the data that we have in the lab, we don't have devices or sensors or ability to actually capture that out in the field. That became a burning question that I just couldn't get out of my mind, and started to figure out ways to start to capture some of that insight that we have in the lab and bring it to the field.
Right. As you talk about physiological sort of changes and biomechanics, you can certainly see your passion come through. I don't know if I've ever shared with you. So I used to run track in school as well, many years ago, of course, now. And something we didn't have access to was really real-time data capture. Right. And so what I know of Tyme Wear is that you're essentially an endurance technology company. Talk to us a little bit more about your value proposition as you see it today.
Very simply put, we help our users improve their endurance. So we have a sensing technology that very accurately measures someone's endurance level. And we all have these unique limiters within our endurance, existing in our muscles, that are measurable. And these limiters are what keeps us from improving. And these are identifiable by measuring it in certain ways. You can measure it in the lab with breathing. So you put a mask on your face and you identify where these limiters lie. You can measure it with blood lactate. And there are certain other ways, but those are the primary ways, sort of the gold standard ways. And what we do with Tyme Wear is that we basically figured out how to take the breathing aspect of it, embed it in a sensor that is a lot less cumbersome than a mask. So we can actually embed it in a vest or a sports bra, and you can wear it and get the same kind of insight that you would get from the lab to identify your limiters, understand your ability to output work and the efficiency of that work. And so what we then do with the data once we capture it is that we analyze it to understand how each person can individualize their training to target and improve those limits. And then we track that improvement over time. So that's kind of what happens all in the back end. What the user sees is they just see where their limiters are. They know how to target them through the app and the interfaces that we have that interact with the data coming from our sensor. And then they're able to target those limits as they train and then see how they improve and always keep track with their improvement.
And I think the piece around ensuring athletes have access to almost lab grade accuracy in terms of the data they're able to see and then the insights they're able to garner from as well is super important. You know, it's interesting to say because we haven't seen too many unicorns in this space, right? And I think there are different reasons for it. On one side, you have a lot of startups, so much so that I think consumers are going through this choice paralysis. So many startups with different technologies. So how do we make a selection? There's an aspect to a lack of awareness, right? And the ability to access even in some unique cases. What would you say Tyme Wear's North Star aspiration is and why, I guess, us as consumers should really believe in what you're putting out there right now?
So the first thing was the scalability of a technology like this, right? Like, why isn't there something out there that is, $1 billion? And give people a sense of context. Mm-hmm. Just a few years ago, when we were starting out, the very sensor that is today available, you can buy it on our website today, that very sensor cost thousands of dollars. And within a span of a few years, that has come down, to $10. Mm-hmm. And so we're very early in this wave of being able to embed certain technology, certain sensing technology in form factors that are accessible, comfortable, machine washable, generally usable in the environment in which they're intended to be used. So we're very early in those days. So just the ability to capture this information is like a couple of years old. Your second question with regards to, why this or what we're doing as opposed to something else. And it comes down to the applicability of the data set you're capturing and how that addresses the problem that you're ultimately trying to answer. Mm-hmm. How close to the truth are you getting? And so there are lots of devices out there and wearables like, wrist-based wearables and things like that. And they are good for certain aspects of what we try to do as users. And they're very bad at other things. And the confusion comes when those things try to do things that they're not actually meant to do. So heart rate is a very good example. That's the most common sort of data set that's measured from a wrist-based wearable. Heart rate does not measure endurance directly, approximates it based on formulas that are based on the truth. And then they use those formulas to apply to a broad population. But really what it's actually doing is assuming that every single person in that population is the average. Mm-hmm. And so you have kind of an approximation that assumes everyone is the average of the population when really it's a very wide spread. And the reason it does that is because the data doesn't contain the information necessary to individualize someone's endurance level or how they should train to improve it. There are data sets that are available that come off our body, they're coming off it right now, that we can capture that actually allow us to do those things. But the hardware, the ability to actually capture that information and pull out that insight isn't available until now, where these sensing technologies that we're working with have actually come online and are now available to use, easy to wear. And so we're very early in this wave of really trying to understand what's actually going on in the body. So we're kind of moving away from this, large data, large scale application where everyone is kind of the average of the population. And with these sensors coming online, we're now able to get to a more individualized N of one experiments where we understand what works for you, where you are, how you progress, and so forth. So that's really the exciting piece. And we're so early in that transformation.
I think you touched on really two important points, right? We saw in the first wave of wearables, really products being price and cost prohibitive. So you had, like you said, solutions which are $1,000 plus, but that's not necessarily scalable. And it's interesting to see that evolution for sure. When we think about soft matter, we believe we operate at the intersect of soft goods and textiles and devices. And I think from our perspective, we've really seen an opportunity for this physical real estate, which is our human body, to enable a whole host of solutions, right? Especially when it comes to next to skin form factors. What role do you feel that textiles and clothing essentially play in the future of all these possibilities?
For me, it's a vehicle to get closer to the source of the data. If you want to get something that is accurate, that is actionable, that's useful ultimately, the further you get away from that, the more approximations and estimations you make. So you muddy the waters, basically. So clothing and fabrics, they are what we naturally wear all the time. They are what are covering many of these very important and valuable data sources. Accessing those data sources easier, more reliable, more accurate, being able to build additional value chains on top of that, like services, like coaching, like health and wellness applications. We needed to capture breathing and ventilation. There are two sources of that information. One is how the chest cavity is moving, the volume of which and how it's going in and out to capture how much air is going in and out of the lungs. And the other is at the face. We took the tack that we didn't think people would be running around with face masks on. COVID, maybe showed a different light on that, but I think people kind of quickly reverted to not liking having those on their face. So we needed something even more invisible to the user, and that's where the clothing form factor really came into play. Is that allowed us to, in a form factor that is easily wearable, that's comfortable to wear, that you forget that you're wearing, and robust, but also breathable, thermal capacity in terms of how well you either heat someone or cool someone, the stretch and recovery of a fabric. All these are sort of parameters you can play with in the textile space. Just that on its own, in terms of how that can then blend with a sensor, is very exciting.
Okay. Maybe to digress just a little bit, if you take the point in time we are living right now, there's a lot of volatility going on globally, right? Politically, economically, and it's not the best case scenario when you're a startup. On one hand, you have this notion of these types of constraints make you innovate faster, learn faster, keep things frugal, right? On the other hand, there's a direct implication to access to capital. What are you feeling and sensing as a startup going through this right now?
Well, as a startup, you're always resource constrained, both time, money, people. That's kind of the natural state of being. To some respects, it's helpful because you want to. It does force you to focus, but it also can cause delays and timeline shifts and things like that, which are kind of annoying. And so when you're in the early stages, when you're trying to get at this sort of like when you're trying to extract this truth that you've identified, like you have this idea, like that's. Why don't people do this? Like you're already living in the future. You're trying to extract that truth and make it available to other people. That problem is like you can completely ignore the external stuff because you don't need that many people. So the sort of the global things that are happening don't really impact you that much because there are enough people to that sort of that don't fit that mold. The work is really you're trying to figure out how to make your product available and accessible to people. Everything else kind of becomes a distraction. So it's the constant iteration of improving and understanding how to make it better. And it's what I kind of talk about as like error correcting. So you're starting with this fundamental idea, and then you're error correcting until you have something that works, and then you work out the bugs, and you just chronically, continuously error correcting. The external environment, like when you go out and fundraise, like that's a blip. That's kind of like, you do that as fast as you can or as little as you can, and then you go back to error correcting. And ideally, you never fundraise. Like you can somehow self-support or bootstrap. That's like the ideal scenario because that's just a distraction. You hear about people being or it being more difficult to raise funds, and that's certainly true. At the end of the day, like money is not going to solve the problems. It's actually solving the problems, like doing the work to solve the problems that does it. Right. And money is an enabler, but it's a necessary evil kind of in a startup, basically. It's kind of my take on it.
I think that's a very interesting perspective and really good advice to entrepreneurs out there. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today. We look forward to hearing more about what Tyme Wear is up to and continuing this dialogue.
Thanks for having me.